On January 12, 2026, President Donald Trump posted 6 words on Truth Social that sent shock through global markets. This order is final and conclusive. The full statement read, "Effective immediately, any country doing business with the Islamic Republic of Iran will pay a tariff of 25% on any and all business being done with the United States of America." That's it. No formal press conference, no detailed policy briefing, no phased implementation, just a social media post declaring that every nation on earth with any commercial ties to Iran now faces a 25% penalty on all their exports to the United States. Effective immediately. And here's what makes this unprecedented. We're not talking about a handful of rogue states. We're talking about over 100 countries that, according to trade data from the first half of 2025, engaged in some form of commerce with Iran. That includes 2 of the world's largest economies, China and India, nations that together account for hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade with the United States. Within hours, the Chinese embassy in Washington issued a statement calling the tariffs indiscriminate and an example of long-arm jurisdiction. A spokesperson from China's foreign ministry declared that Beijing would take all necessary measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. That's diplomatic language, but it's pointed diplomatic language. India, meanwhile, found itself blindsided. Officials scrambled to assess whether their investments in Iran's Chabahar port, a strategic asset worth over $500 million, would now be classified as doing business under this new framework. The Economic Times reported that Indian exporters immediately raised alarms, worried about what this means for pharmaceuticals, agricultural goods, and the broader trade relationship that's supposed to be heading toward $500 billion annually. The timing is critical. This announcement dropped while Iran is experiencing widespread internal protests. There's been a nationwide communications blackout. Speculation about potential US military involvement has intensified. The Trump administration is framing this tariff as part of a renewed maximum pressure campaign to isolate the Iranian regime economically. But the method, hitting Iran's trading partners rather than Iran directly, creates an entirely different set of consequences. And here's the part that raises serious constitutional questions. The tariff was invoked under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as CEPA. This is a law designed for genuine national emergencies. Frozen assets, sanctions during crises, that sort of thing. Using it to impose a blanket 25% tariff on imports from over 100 countries, that's legally contested territory. In fact, the US Supreme Court is currently reviewing whether Trump even has the authority to use IEPA this way. A ruling is expected later this month. Let me put that in perspective. The administration imposed a tariff that could affect trillions of dollars in global commerce, and the very legal foundation for that tariff is under active Supreme Court scrutiny. If the court rules against it, the US government could potentially be on the hook to refund up to $150 billion in duties already collected under IEEPA authority. That's not a small number. That's a budget crisis waiting to happen. So, what exactly is going on here? Why does this matter? And why should anyone watching this care about a tariff announcement on a Sunday afternoon? Because this isn't just about Iran. This is about how the United States conducts trade with the entire world, and the ripple effects are already being felt. Let's start with China, because that's where the real stakes become clear. China accounts for over 90% of Iran's oil exports. Those aren't direct transactions. US sanctions already prohibit that. Instead, China uses indirect channels, intermediary companies, ship-to-ship transfers, and other mechanisms to import Iranian crude while technically avoiding the letter of American sanctions. It's been an open secret for years. Everyone in Washington knows it's happening. Beijing knows Washington knows. But now, Trump has essentially said, we're done looking the other way. If you're doing any business with Iran, any business at all, you pay 25% on everything you sell to Americans. For China, that's not a minor complication. It's a potential trade war multiplier. Chinese exports to the United States totaled approximately $427 billion annually before this announcement. Layer a 25% Iran penalty on top of existing tariffs. some of which already hit 30% or higher. And you're looking at effective rates that could push past 45% or even 50% on certain goods. That matters because the US and China had just reached a fragile détente. In October 2025, negotiations produced a trade truce that lowered average tariffs from 40.8% to 30.8%. It wasn't peace, but it was progress. And now, Bloomberg Economics is warning that this Iran tariff could derail those talks entirely. The Chinese response has been measured but firm. State media outlets like the Global Times frame the tariff as economic coercion. Officials have hinted at retaliatory measures targeting US agricultural and technology exports. We've seen this playbook before. It's what happened during the first Trump-era trade war. American farmers bore the brunt of Chinese retaliation. Soybean exports collapsed. The federal government had to spend billions in emergency subsidies to keep the agricultural sector afloat. Now imagine that scenario, but worse. Because this time, the tariff isn't targeting a specific Chinese practice or a specific sector. It's targeting China's relationship with a third country. And that creates a much messier precedent. Here's why that matters. If the US can impose blanket tariffs on any nation doing business with Iran, what stops it from doing the same for any nation doing business with Russia, or Venezuela, or any country that falls out of favor with an American administration? The answer is nothing. That's the whole point of invoking IEPA. It gives the president extraordinary discretion to declare emergencies and act unilaterally. Congress doesn't need to vote. There's no lengthy regulatory process. It's executive power at its most expansive. And that's precisely why the Supreme Court is now involved. Let's talk about what's happening in the courts, because this is where the story takes a constitutional turn. Over the past year, more than 1,000 companies have sued the federal government over Trump's tariff authority. Their argument is straightforward. IEPA doesn't actually authorize tariffs. The law gives the president power to regulate imports during emergencies, but regulation and taxation are different things. Tariffs are taxes. And under Article 1 of the Constitution, only Congress has the power to impose taxes. The lower courts have sided with the challengers. The Court of International Trade ruled that the IEPA tariffs are unlawful. The Federal Circuit affirmed that ruling in an en banc decision, that means the full court, not just a 3-judge panel, agreed that the administration exceeded its authority. The reasoning was clear. If Congress had wanted to give presidents the power to impose tariffs under emergency powers, it would have said so explicitly. It didn't. The case is now before the Supreme Court. Oral arguments took place in November 2025, and based on the questioning, several justices appeared skeptical of the government's position. Justice Amy Coney Barrett raised concerns about the mess that could result from refund claims. Justice Neil Gorsuch questioned whether tariffs are really the same as regulatory licenses. Even justices who typically defer to executive authority in foreign affairs seemed uncomfortable with the scope of what the administration was claiming. The government's argument, presented by Solicitor General Sauer, boils down to this. Trade is a tool of foreign policy, and presidents need flexibility to respond to global threats. Tariffs are just another form of leverage. They've been used before under the Trading with the Enemy Act, under previous emergency powers, and courts have generally deferred to presidential judgment. The challengers, led by prominent attorneys including Neil Katyal, counter that this is precisely the kind of expansive claim the non-delegation doctrine is supposed to prevent. Congress can't hand over its taxing authority to the executive without clear guidelines, and IEPA doesn't provide those guidelines. It was designed to block transactions and freeze assets during genuine crises, not to restructure the entire US import system based on which countries trade with which other countries. A decision is expected sometime in the next few weeks, and here's the tension. The administration has already collected over $200 billion in IEPA-related tariff revenue since 2025. If the court rules those tariffs were unconstitutional, what happens to that money? Some legal analysts believe the court will opt for prospective relief, meaning tariffs would be struck down going forward, but importers wouldn't get refunds for past payments. That avoids the chaos of a $150 billion repayment scramble. But it also means the government keeps money it collected without proper authority. Others think the court might split the difference, striking down certain tariffs while allowing others under different statutory authority. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allows tariffs for national security purposes. Section 301 allows tariffs to address unfair trade practices. Both have been used by Trump, and both face their own challenges, but they're on slightly firmer constitutional ground than IEPA. The uncertainty is the point. No one knows exactly how the court will rule. And until it does, every business that imports goods into the United States is operating in legal limbo. Now let's turn to India, because that relationship tells a different story. India's trade with Iran is nowhere near China's scale. Bilateral commerce totaled about $1.34 billion in the first 10 months of 2025. That's organic chemicals, fruits and nuts, mineral fuels, relatively modest categories in the context of India's overall trade portfolio. But here's the complication. India has strategic investments in Iran that go beyond simple commodity trade. The Chabahar port is the most significant. India has committed over $500 million to developing this facility, which provides a crucial bypass route to Afghanistan and Central Asia without going through Pakistan. It's been treated as a geopolitical priority, not just a commercial venture. The question now is whether Chabahar falls under the tariff umbrella. The Trump administration hasn't clarified. The White House hasn't defined what doing business actually means in this context. Is it just imports and exports? Does it include infrastructure investments, joint ventures, banking relationships? Indian officials have been seeking clarity through diplomatic channels, but the ambiguity itself is creating pressure. That's probably the point. This tariff announcement didn't come in isolation. It arrived in the middle of an already strained US-India trade relationship. Since August 2025, Indian exports to the United States have faced 50% tariffs. That's a 25% reciprocal tariff plus an additional 25% penalty tied to India's purchases of Russian oil. The Trump administration has been explicit. If India wants relief, it needs to reduce its dependence on Russian energy and open its markets to more American goods, particularly in agriculture and dairy. Now add Iran to the equation. India is essentially being told, cut ties with Russia, cut ties with Iran, or face escalating economic consequences in your relationship with the United States. The response from New Delhi has been measured but frustrated. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal described the tariffs as unfortunate and unjustified. Prime Minister Modi has communicated directly with Trump, emphasizing the strategic partnership between the two countries. There's been no immediate retaliation. India hasn't announced counter-tariffs, but there's also been no capitulation. And here's what's interesting. Despite everything, Indian exports to the United States actually grew 22% in November 2025. The overall number hit $7 billion for the month, driven by sectors that received exemptions: pharmaceuticals, electronics, certain engineering goods. India supplies about 40% of generic medications consumed in the United States. That's not a relationship either side can easily disrupt, but the resilience masks real vulnerability. Textiles, jewelry, and footwear, labor-intensive industries that employ millions of Indian workers, are taking direct hits. Estimates suggest the combined tariff burden could shave 0.5% to 0.6% of India's GDP. So what's India's play? Diversification. Exports to China surged 90% to $2.2 billion. New free trade agreements are advancing with the UK, UAE, Australia, and the European Free Trade Association. The Make in India initiative is accelerating, with production-linked incentive schemes designed to reduce dependence on any single export market. But diversification takes time. And in the meantime, the pressure from Washington isn't letting up. There's reportedly a bill circulating in Congress that would authorize tariffs of up to 500% on countries that continue purchasing Russian energy. That's backed by Senator Lindsey Graham. It hasn't passed, but the fact that it exists at all tells you where this could be headed. Let's zoom out and talk about what this means for the global economy, because the effects aren't limited to China and India. The tariff on Iran's trading partners theoretically affects every nation that has commercial ties with Tehran. That includes the UAE, which serves as a major re-export hub. That includes Turkey, which imports Iranian oil and sells machinery and textiles in return. That includes Iraq, Pakistan, and dozens of smaller economies that maintain trade relationships for geographic or historical reasons. The immediate market reaction was cautious but noticeable. Oil prices jumped to their highest level since November 2025, with Brent crude approaching $64 per barrel. That's not a collapse, but it reflects anxiety about supply disruptions. If major buyers like China face penalties for Iranian oil imports, they might seek alternatives, which tightens global supply and pushes prices up. Asian equity markets dipped slightly on January 13th. The Shanghai Composite fell 0.5%. India's Sensex dropped 0.3%. US futures pointed to a flat open. Gold prices rose as investors looked for safe havens. The dollar weakened against major currencies. None of this constitutes a crisis, but all of it represents friction, and friction in global trade has cumulative effects. The IMF projects global growth at 3.1% for 2026, down from pre-pandemic averages. Tariffs are a contributing factor. They raise costs for businesses, which get passed to consumers. They create uncertainty, which discourages investment. They fragment supply chains, which reduces efficiency. The Tax Foundation estimates that Trump's tariff policies will cost the average American household about $1,500 in 2026 through higher prices on imported goods. That burden falls disproportionately on lower-income families, who spend a larger share of their income on consumer goods. Meanwhile, retaliatory tariffs from US trading partners have already targeted approximately $223 billion in American exports. Agricultural products are particularly vulnerable. So is the technology sector. The estimated job losses from reduced exports. Around 141,000. Now, there are counter-arguments. Proponents of the tariff strategy point to record revenue collection, over $236 billion through November 2025. They argue that tariffs fund domestic priorities, reduce the trade deficit, and create incentives for American manufacturing. Companies like Hyundai have announced expanded US production facilities specifically to avoid import duties. Those aren't trivial benefits. And for workers in protected industries, steel, aluminum, automobiles, the tariffs represent real economic support. But the question is whether the benefits outweigh the costs. And on that, economists are divided. Most mainstream analyses suggest the answer is no, that tariffs reduce overall economic efficiency even when they benefit specific sectors. But the political calculus is different. Protected industries have political power. Diffuse consumer costs are harder to organize around. So where does this leave us? The immediate situation is volatile but not yet catastrophic. Markets are adjusting. Diplomatic channels remain open. The Supreme Court ruling could reshape the entire legal foundation for these tariffs within weeks. But the trajectory is concerning. We're watching the rules-based international trading system come under sustained pressure. The World Trade Organization, already weakened, has struggled to adjudicate disputes when its largest member is actively circumventing multilateral frameworks. Regional trade agreements are proliferating, but they're fragmenting rather than integrating global commerce. For China, the Iran tariff is one more escalation in a relationship that's been deteriorating for years. The window for a genuine reset, the kind of comprehensive agreement that addresses intellectual property, market access, industrial subsidies, and currency manipulation, seems to be closing. Instead, we're getting transactional skirmishes. A tariff here, a counter-tariff there, neither side willing to make the concessions necessary for lasting stability. For India, the calculus is more complicated. The strategic partnership with the United States remains valuable. Counterweight to China, technology cooperation, defense ties. But the tariff pressure is testing that partnership. And if India concludes that American demands are simply unacceptable, that it can't abandon Russian energy without jeopardizing its own security, that it can't open agricultural markets without destroying domestic farmers, then the relationship could cool significantly. The Iran dimension adds another layer. The Trump administration is clearly trying to maximize economic isolation of the Iranian regime. But the method, punishing third countries for their Iranian trade, creates incentives for those countries to develop alternative financial systems, alternative trade routes, and alternative relationships that don't depend on American goodwill. That's already happening. China and Russia have expanded direct currency settlement mechanisms. India is exploring rupee-based trade agreements. The BRICS nations are discussing alternatives to dollar-denominated commerce. These efforts are still nascent, but they reflect a growing wariness of American economic power being deployed as a geopolitical weapon. And then there's the Supreme Court. A ruling against IEEPA tariffs wouldn't just affect the Iran-related duties. It would call into question the legal basis for a significant portion of Trump's trade policy. The administration would likely pivot to other authorities, Section 232, Section 301, potentially new congressional delegations. But the transition would create uncertainty. Markets don't like uncertainty. If the court rules in favor of the administration, that's a different kind of precedent. It essentially confirms that presidents can impose substantial economic measures through emergency declarations with minimal congressional oversight. Future administrations of either party would have that tool available, and the line between genuine emergencies and policy preferences would become even blurrier than it already is. Here's what to watch in the coming days. First, the Supreme Court. A decision could come at any time. The legal community expects something by the end of January, but the court operates on its own schedule. Second, US-India talks. A critical call was scheduled for January 13, 2026, the day after the Iran tariff announcement. The timing wasn't coincidental. Watch for any signals about exemptions, waivers, or negotiated pathways that might reduce India's exposure. Third, China's response. Beijing has options ranging from diplomatic protests to targeted retaliation to broader economic countermeasures. The choice they make will signal how seriously they're taking this escalation. Fourth, oil markets. If major buyers start rerouting away from Iranian crude in response to the tariff threat, prices will move. If they don't, if China and others conclude the tariff is unenforceable or temporary, prices might stabilize. Fifth, corporate behavior. Over 1,000 companies have already filed suits to protect their refund rights. More will follow. The administrative machinery for processing tariff claims is about to be stress-tested in ways it wasn't designed for. None of these threads has a clean resolution. That's the nature of trade disputes. They don't end so much as evolve. Today's tariff becomes tomorrow's negotiating leverage, becomes next year's established practice. What's clear is that the architecture of global trade is under strain. The institutions designed to manage disputes are weakening. The norms that governed economic relationships are eroding. And the consequences fall on ordinary people, consumers paying higher prices, workers in disrupted industries, businesses trying to plan amid uncertainty. The 25% tariff on Iran's trading partners is one move in a much larger game, but it's a significant move. And what happens next will shape the economic landscape for years to come. The question isn't whether this will have consequences. It's who will bear them and for how long. Let me explain one more dimension that often gets overlooked: the enforcement problem. The White House hasn't clarified how doing business with Iran will actually be defined or verified. Think about the complexity here. A German auto parts company sells components to a Turkish manufacturer, which sells finished goods to an American retailer. The Turkish company also exports machinery to Iran. Does that make the German components subject to the tariff? Tracing these commercial relationships across global supply chains is extraordinarily difficult. Companies have thousands of suppliers and sub-suppliers spread across dozens of countries. Determining which relationships constitute doing business with Iran requires a level of due diligence that most businesses aren't equipped to perform, and that US Customs isn't staffed to verify. This ambiguity creates leverage. When rules are unclear, enforcement becomes discretionary. Countries that cooperate on other priorities might get waivers. Countries that don't might face the full weight of the penalty. American businesses importing goods have no clear guidance on what's allowed. Do they need to audit their entire supply chain for Iranian connections? What liability do they face if a supplier has ties they weren't aware of? These questions don't have answers yet. That's why over 1,000 companies have filed protective lawsuits, not because they're confident they'll win, but because they need to preserve legal options in case the rules change or the Supreme Court invalidates the underlying authority. There's also a geopolitical dimension that extends beyond economics. When the United States pressures third countries to sever ties with Iran, it's asking them to sacrifice their own interests for American foreign policy objectives. Some will comply. Countries heavily dependent on US markets may calculate that defiance costs more than compliance, but others won't. China considers American sanctions on Iran illegitimate overreach. Beijing's energy security depends on diversified oil sources, and Iran provides a hedge against disruption elsewhere. India faces a similar calculus with Chabahar. That port isn't just commercial, it's a strategic counterweight to Pakistan's Gwadar port, which China is developing as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Abandoning Chabahar would cede influence over Central Asian trade routes to Beijing, so the tariff creates a contradiction. The stated goal is isolating Iran. But pressuring countries the US wants as counterweights to China may actually push them closer to Beijing. This is the risk of weaponizing economic relationships too aggressively. Short-term compliance may come at the cost of long-term alignment. Countries start building systems designed to reduce their vulnerability to American pressure. Alternative payment mechanisms, alternative trade routes, alternative partnerships. Those systems don't disappear when the immediate crisis passes. What happens from here will depend on decisions not yet made. The Supreme Court ruling will be decisive for the legal dimension. If IEEPA tariffs are struck down, the administration will need alternative authorities or congressional action. If upheld, expect further expansion. US-China relations will remain tense regardless. The underlying disputes over technology, subsidies, and market access aren't going away. Tariffs are symptoms of deeper strategic competition. US-India talks will continue, but a comprehensive agreement remains elusive. America wants market access and alignment against adversaries. India wants autonomy to pursue its own energy security. Bridging that gap requires political will, nor the government has demonstrated. For ordinary people, workers, consumers, small business owners, the costs will keep accumulating. Higher prices, job uncertainty in trade-exposed industries, delayed investments that might have created opportunities. This is what happens when trade policy becomes an instrument of geopolitical competition. The boundaries between economics and security blur. Efficiency takes a backseat to leverage. And the architecture of global commerce that took decades to build gets reshaped in ways that may not be easily reversed. The 25% tariff on Iran's trading partners isn't an endpoint. It's a signal of where things are headed. More pressure, more retaliation, more fragmentation. The only question is how far it goes before something breaks. Here's something worth understanding about the mechanics of all this. When Trump says, any country doing business with Iran will pay a 25% tariff, he's not directly taxing foreign governments. Tariffs don't work that way. What actually happens is that American importers, companies that bring foreign goods into the United States, pay the duty to US customs at the point of entry. Those costs then ripple through the supply chain, ultimately landing on American consumers and businesses. So when a Chinese manufacturer sells electronics to a US retailer, the retailer pays the tariff. Not China, not the manufacturer, the American company. And typically, that cost gets passed forward in the form of higher prices on store shelves. This is important because it reframes who's actually bearing the burden. The rhetoric suggests we're punishing foreign countries for their Iran ties. The reality is we're taxing American businesses for purchasing from those countries. The foreign country might lose sales if American buyers switch suppliers, but the immediate financial hit lands domestically. The Tax Foundation's analysis estimates Trump's combined tariff measures reduce American GDP by 0.5% to 0.7% in the long run. The average American household will pay roughly $1,500 more in 2026 due to higher prices on imported goods. That burden falls hardest on lower-income families, who spend a larger share of their income on consumer goods. Proponents argue these short-term costs are worth long-term gains. Tariffs create incentives for domestic manufacturing. If importing becomes expensive, companies build factories in America instead. There's some evidence for this. We've seen manufacturing investment announcements, particularly in automobiles and semiconductors, but there's also evidence that many companies simply absorb costs, raise prices, or shift sourcing to other foreign countries rather than reshoring. The economic picture is complicated, and reasonable people disagree about whether the trade-offs make sense. What's not in dispute is that this represents a fundamental shift in how America engages with the global economy. For decades, the consensus in Washington favored open trade, multilateral agreements, and institutions like the WTO to manage disputes. That consensus has fractured, and what's emerging in its place is something more transactional, more confrontational, and more uncertain. Whether that's good or bad depends on your perspective, but it's definitely different, and the consequences are only beginning to unfold.